Hey there, today we're learning about Mitre Saw Safety. The reason we start with Mitre Saw Safety is because the first step is to cut your material to rough length. If you have an 8-foot board and you're only making a little project, you don't need to plane, join, table saw all that 8 feet. So we're going to use the Mitre Saw to cut our material down to rough length. Now this is a sliding compound miter saw. It means it can turn and cut miters, but it can also turn and cut bevels. So this is a pretty versatile piece of equipment. It's for cross cuts. We use it to cross cut the wood. So the first thing you're going to do is make sure that the blade guard is working properly. We've got a clear blade guard here, and as I drop this down, the blade guard should move out of the way so I can cut the wood and then move back into place to protect me as I pull the saw back up. The second point is to make sure we're not going to cut any wood that's too short. If I'm cutting a piece of wood less than a foot long, I'm going to run into problems. My hand is going to be really close to the blade, and the pieces are going to be too small to put through the jointer and the planer if they're less than a foot. So that's our second point. Our third point is making sure that the wood is well supported. If the wood has a bow in it, such as this piece of wood, I have a little gap underneath, what's going to happen is as I cut this piece of wood, that's going to fall to the table, it's going to pinch the blade, and it's going to kick back. So I want to make sure that the wood is well supported. If I wanted to cut this 2x4, I'd probably flip it over and make sure that there was no gap underneath the wood and no gap between the wood and the fence. So we've learned a couple of things already. We got our table, we got our fence, and we want to make sure that the wood is tight against the fence and tight against the table when we begin to cut. Our third point is we want to check the wood for knots and grit and staples and checks, things of that nature. So we've got some knots in this wood here, so I'm going to avoid cutting through those pieces if I can. And we've also got some checks. Checks are cracks in the wood. Cracks in the wood just result from moisture leaving the wood and wood pulling away from itself, the wood grains, and we get checks that are cracks in the wood. So we're going to look for those because if the wood moves while I'm cutting it, it's going to result in kickback as well. Our next point is keeping our hands at least 6 inches or maybe a hand width away from the blade. So an easy way to remember is the 1 hand width rule, that if I'm going to hold this piece of wood as I should, it's going to be 1 hand width away from the blade. So we want to keep that hand width distance on all of our tools, not just the miter saw, but also on the jointer and the table saw and the band saw. You want to keep your hand a hand width away from that blade at all times. This is a no-go zone, so the yellow zone, sometimes a red zone on the insert of this table is where we don't want to put our hands. If there's anything left on the table after we make our cut, we could grab a piece of scrap wood and we can push that scrap out of the way. We can use a brush to pull those things out of the way, but we don't want our hand in this area anywhere where the blade can be. The way this blade rotates towards me means that as I'm cutting, this blade could climb up the workpiece towards my hand at any given time. So I'm going to want to make sure that my hand is at least 1 hand width away at all times. When we go to cut the wood, we're going to want to make sure it's clamped down securely. We've got a clamp here. It's a cam type clamp. We're going to use our hand, but we're also going to use the clamp for an extra measure. So when we line up our blade in place of where we want to make the cut, we're also going to clamp that workpiece down so it doesn't move on us. We're never going to cross our arms when you're using the miter saw. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but if I was in a position where I was holding the wood on this side and operating the saw with my right hand, you can see the danger there pretty easily. And likewise, if I'm holding the saw with my right hand here on the left side and I'm running the saw with my left arm, that's going to be a really dangerous place for my arm to be. I'm not going to want to do that either. We're not going to cut round or regular shaped stock on the miter saw. As you can see, round wood isn't going to be well supported by the table and the fence. You're going to have some big gaps there between the table and the fence, and it's going to want to spin. If I have a round blade trying to cut a round object, what that's going to do is it's going to create a spin. And more likely than not, it's going to spin that workpiece in such a way that your hand's going to be drawn towards the blade. So we're going to avoid cutting round or regular shaped stock on the miter saw. If a stop is being used, we're going to hold the wood between the blade and the stop. If this was my stop and I was making multiple repeated cuts, I'm going to want to make sure that this piece is held securely. If anything's going to kick back, it's going to be the piece that's pinched between my stop and my blade. So I'm going to want to make sure I clamp this side, not my waste side, but my good side. I'm always going to clamp that one down. Make sure the ends of the longboard are well supported. So we're very blessed here in the big shop. We have these big outfeed tables. The ends of the longboard won't flip down. Sometimes when we're on work sites and we're just working on sawhorses, we've got 12-foot boards. We cut that in the middle. What's going to happen is the ends of those boards are going to go down and the middle is going to flip up. It's going to hit you in the face. It might knock our saw out of calibration, and everybody's going to laugh at you. Wear both eye and hearing protection in the shop. So we got our safety glasses on. We got our hearing protection in. We're going to want to make sure that we also remove any sort of watches or jewelry before we use any power tools. These are a hazard as they can get caught in the machines, caught on the wood as we're transferring wood as well. So we're going to remove those. Hands are clear. Okay, so in order to use the miter saw, we're going to make our first measurement. Say I needed something 8 inches long. Well, hopefully my project has multiple pieces. If my end cut is 8 inches, that's too short. I need it to be a foot long, if you will recall from the beginning of the video. So hopefully if my project has a couple of pieces in it that are 8 inches, I can combine those. So instead of cutting 8 inches, I would cut 16 inches and then add an inch for rough length. So at this point, I'm going to measure 17 inches, and I've avoided my knots, which is awesome. So I've made a small mark with my pencil. I've taken my square and I've squared that mark, and I have a little waist mark as well. The waist mark tells me which side of the line to cut on. So I'm right-handed, so I like to keep my piece I'm going to keep on the left side so I can operate the saw with my right hand. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the blade without touching the trigger onto my line. Once that's lined up beside my line, I'm going to move my clamp over and I'm going to clamp it securely in place so it doesn't move while I'm cutting it. I'm going to recheck my line at this point. I'm still good. I'm going to hold the wood with my fingers pushing down against the table and my thumb pushing in against the fence with a good grip like this. I'm going to put 1 foot back so I can have a nice, strong, steady stance, and now I'm ready to cut. I'm going to pull the saw out all the way. I'm going to fire it up about here, not on the wood, but away from the wood. I'm going to cut the wood. I'm going to release the trigger, let the blade come to a complete stop, still holding on, and then up, away from the wood once that blade is stopped. My cut is complete. I can move my waste material away from the saw so it's ready for the next person to use. So let's do that cut. My hand is a hand width away. My fingers are pushing down, my thumb's pushing in. I'm not allowing my thumb to drift towards the blade at any point. I have a nice strong stance, and I'm ready to cut. I let the blade come to a complete stop, and then up. Now at the end of the day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock the saw in the down position so that if somebody wants to hurt themselves, they really got to try pretty hard to do that. And I'm ready to move on to my next tool, which will be the jointer. So thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, please email me at all. And we've got a quiz available for you on D2L to complete, and we'll get you the marks for that.